The signal was faint at first, a mere blip lost in the endless noise of space. Dr. Tessa Moreno sat in her dimly lit station, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the metal desk, her eyes squinting against the glow of the monitors. Static filled the headphones as she strained to listen, her breath held tight as if something fragile would shatter if she exhaled. Her colleagues, slumped in their seats or pacing the floor, were on the verge of exhaustion. 10 years of waiting, 10 years of hoping, yet every night ended the same. Nothing but silence and static. But tonight there was something different. Her finger hovered over the replay button. It wasn't an anomaly or a glitch. No, this was something intentional, precise. A faint beat, regular and unwavering like the pulse of a machine. She pressed replay, and there it was again. A pattern looping every 47 minutes, threading through the static like a whisper hiding in the dark. "Tessa, you hearing that?" Dr. Chen asked, leaning over her shoulder, his face pale in the glow of her screen. His normally skeptical expression had softened, replaced with something resembling fear. "Yes," Tessa whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. It's not noise. It's structured, and it's coming from the direction of Messier 87. They ran checks, double-checked for errors, and ruled out interference. The signal persisted, defying the odds, refusing to be dismissed. The message pulsed on the screen, digits and dashes weaving in a language they couldn't understand, but could almost feel. An urgency filled the room, the silent but shared sense that something immense had finally breached the void between their world and the unknown. Hours slipped away. The message, now an object of relentless scrutiny, pulsed every 47 minutes, filling the room with a sense of dreadful anticipation. They watched, waiting, the soft hum of machinery, now magnified by the silence of their collective breaths. And then, bit by bit, Tessa began deciphering fragments, a broken language, stark commands. Some of the characters resembled mathematical principles, others mirrored code sequences she recognized but couldn't fully grasp. What she could translate made her stomach twist. Prepare, connect, transcend. A shiver ran down her spine. These words, abstract yet unsettlingly clear, burrowed into her mind. She wanted to dismiss it as random fragments, something lost in translation. But a deeper instinct, something primal, whispered otherwise. This wasn't a call for communication, it was a command. The next few nights were a blur of strained eyes and whispered hypotheses. The team was pulled into an obsessive rhythm, each replay of the signal rooting them deeper into the relentless pulse of its message. The commands grew in clarity, urging actions that were both intriguing and hauntingly specific. Constructing circuits, rerouting power systems, recalibrating energy fields. It felt like they were being guided, led by the hand of something other. Soon Tessa noticed that her colleagues weren't themselves. She saw it in the subtle, nearly invisible ways. The long stares at the machines, the unconscious tapping of their fingers in time with the signal's pulsing rhythm. The longer they stayed near the machines, the harder it became to remember what it was like to be at ease. The silence between them grew tense, fraught with an unspoken dread. And every time the signal pulsed, she felt a tug, a compulsion to answer. One night, she woke at her desk, head throbbing, memories of her own actions slipping like sand between her fingers. She had been running calculations, her fingers typing frantically, but the logic didn't make sense. Symbols and patterns she didn't remember studying filled the screen. She stared, mouth dry, as the symbols warped and stretched, almost alive, like some kind of ancient script she had somehow always known. That was when the dreams began. The signal echoed in her mind even as she slept, looping like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. In her dreams, she floated in a dark expanse, cold and timeless, with distant, half-formed shapes moving around her, shadows against a void. She couldn't make out their forms, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting, something ancient and patient. They radiated malice, a hatred that permeated her very being. She would wake up, gasping, clutching her chest, the lingering sensation of those unseen eyes crawling over her skin. She began to notice the others moving as if in a trance, their faces pale, hands shaking slightly, yet they continued to work. Her attempts to question them were met with blank stares, empty promises to just follow the data, as if the signal itself had become a deity to them, a god whose commands they could not question. Days turned into nights without sleep, the signal now a familiar presence that filled every corner of their lives. There was a word, or at least something that felt like a word, repeating again and again in the hidden layers of the data. When she pieced it together, it sent a chill through her that felt like ice slipping down her spine. Submission. The word pulsed on her screen, a subtle addition to the commands. It hadn't been there before, of that she was certain. But now it seemed like the foundation of every other instruction. They were not building for discovery or exploration. They were submitting, obeying, fulfilling a purpose beyond human comprehension. It wasn't an invitation to explore, it was a summons, an order to comply. One night as she left the lab, the familiar signal still whispering in her ears, she noticed the stars. They blinked down, unmoved, indifferent, like eyes watching her from an incomprehensible distance. The stars had once been a source of hope, symbols of endless possibility. Now they were silent witnesses, cold and unreachable, their gaze heavy and accusatory, as if they knew the fate she was inching toward. She could feel it in her bones, the knowledge settling like lead. They hadn't discovered a signal meant to be found. They had answered a call that should never have reached them. In that moment, she knew that whatever was out there was no longer just watching. It was coming, and they had already begun to obey. Tessa didn't remember how it began, the feeling of being guided, her hands following invisible paths across her workstation as if an unseen force moved her fingers. The commands of the signal had become more specific, detailing blueprints and protocols, sequences that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. These weren't mere suggestions, they were instructions, demands etched in binary and symbols that seemed to possess a life of their own. At first, she thought it was curiosity, some deeply rooted scientific drive that urged her to construct the machinery outlined in the signal. But the compulsion grew, overpowering her thoughts until her own mind felt like a distant observer. Every night, Tessa would watch her own hands assembling circuit boards, attaching wires to strange, iridescent crystals that the team had forged based on diagrams from the signal. The metal and glass they were used to working with now pulsed with organic, almost flesh-like quality, an alien elegance that defied explanation. Her team was just as transfixed. Dr. Chen, a staunch skeptic, had developed an almost fanatical fascination with the machinery. She would catch him late at night, running his fingers over the alien components as if he could absorb their secrets through touch alone. Dr. Naima, their senior engineer, once a pragmatic and cautious scientist, now wore a permanent, glassy stare as she soldiered circuits with a feverish determination. The air around them buzzed with a hum that seemed to throb in rhythm with their own heartbeats, an invisible presence sinking into their bones, guiding every movement. It was as if they were possessed. The first prototype, a device meant to open dimensions according to the signal, was completed in a matter of days. Tessa stared at it, a strange mixture of awe and dread twisting in her chest. The device was alien, an obelisk of metal and glass, wound with shimmering filaments that pulsed as if alive. But even more unnerving was the low hum it emitted, filling the room with a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the mind, an insistent droning that made her head ache. She found herself moving closer to it, drawn toward it by some primal compulsion she couldn't resist. That night, her dreams took on a sharper clarity. She floated in the dark expanse, cold and weightless, surrounded by shapes, colossal pulsing masses that drifted soundlessly around her. They were shadows, yet they exuded a presence, a dark intelligence that radiated hunger and rage. She could feel them as though they were wrapped around her, absorbing her warmth, her life. They were aware of her, and they resented her existence, her mere being an affront to them. One of the shapes drifted closer, its form indistinct, a shroud of shadow and malice. Her mind splintered under its gaze, fracturing into a million terrified thoughts as it reached out with tendrils of darkness that burrowed into her, exploring, dissecting. She felt herself unraveling, her thoughts dissolving like ink in water, a scream frozen in her throat. It was then she realized these weren't dreams, they were visions, glimpses of another reality clawing its way into hers, dragging her mind into its depths. She awoke drenched in sweat, the hum of the prototype still ringing in her ears. Her hands shook as she wiped her face, her fingers cold and numb. The fear lingered, but an unsettling calm followed, a cold certainty. The signal, the commands, the machines, they weren't just tools. They were gateways, opening paths to places beyond human understanding, to dimensions where these ancient beings resided, waiting with a hunger that transcended time. The team pressed on, their movements now eerily synchronized, as if connected by a single mind. Tessa tried to fight it, to resist the pull, but the compulsion was too strong. She watched herself building, constructing, her hands moving with mechanical precision, her mind whispering protests that her body ignored. Every machine they created brought them closer to something vast and unfathomable, each circuit wired like a neuron, each wire a nerve, creating a network that seemed to pulse with a sinister life of its own. The more they worked, the more the signal filled their minds, not just in the lab, but everywhere, in their homes, their cars, even in their sleep. It was a constant, relentless presence, echoing in their heads like the tolling of a distant, invisible bell. Tessa found herself speaking in fragments of the signal's language without meaning to, muttering words that held no human meaning, yet felt intimately familiar, as if they had always been buried somewhere in her subconscious. One night, as she was adjusting a piece of machinery, Tessa caught sight of her reflection in a dark monitor. She barely recognized herself. Her eyes were sunken, hollow, yet there was a glint there, a flicker of something that wasn't her. It moved within her gaze, watching her from behind her own eyes, like an intruder peering out from the depths of her mind. She backed away, heart pounding, the cold realization settling into her bones. Somewhere across the vast reaches of space, they were watching her. Not just her, but all of them. The signal was not a beacon. It was a leash, binding them to something vast and alien, something that viewed them with the detached malice one might have for insects. The final machine they built was unlike the others, towering and sleek, its form almost organic with veins of strange metals that throbbed like arteries. When they powered it on, the entire building shook, the hum reaching a frequency that penetrated every wall, every object, every molecule. Tessa clutched her head, the pain radiating through her skull as the hum evolved into a high-pitched resonance that only they could hear. That night, Tessa's dream was different. She found herself back in the void, but this time she wasn't alone. Her team floated beside her, their expressions blank, their bodies suspended like marionettes, drifting in a vast, inky darkness. And there, surrounding them, was a presence, a being so colossal that her mind couldn't comprehend its shape, a shifting mass of eyes and tendrils and mouths that extended into infinity. Its eyes, countless and endless, turned toward them, piercing through her, dissecting her with a cold, calculating gaze. The entity didn't speak in words. It spoke in sensations, waves of revulsion and anger crashing over her, pressing into her chest until she could barely breathe. It wasn't just observing them, it was evaluating them, measuring them as one might measure something unworthy, an infestation. She felt her mind unraveling under the weight of its hatred, her thoughts scattering as its essence washed over her. She woke gasping, clutching her chest, her heart pounding like a trapped animal. Around her, her team sat in silence, their faces pale, eyes unfocused, yet each wore an expression of vacant contentment, as though whatever they had seen had hollowed them out, leaving only obedient shells. And still, they continued to build. It was clear to Tessa now. They weren't creating technology to understand the universe, or even to communicate with these beings. No, they were building vessels, channels that allowed these cosmic horrors a foothold in their reality. The machines were not for humanity, they were for them, tools through which they could impose their will, their control, their malice. Tessa felt the last traces of hope drained from her. Whatever these entities were, whatever force had sent the signal, it wasn't reaching out in curiosity or diplomacy. They had lured them, manipulated them, drawn them into a trap so subtle, so insidious, that they hadn't realized until it was too late. They weren't builders. They were pawns in a cosmic game they could never hope to understand. And somewhere in the darkness, she felt it again. A presence watching her, amused, patient, waiting for the final piece to fall into place. The machines were coming alive. At first, Tessa thought it was just her mind playing tricks, the result of too many sleepless nights and the relentless hum of the signal echoing in her head. But soon, she realized she wasn't the only one who felt it. The machines vibrated with an intensity that seemed to flow through them like blood, an alien pulse that traveled along the cables and circuitry with a dreadful sentience. Each night, as the team powered up a new device, they all felt it, the oppressive presence lurking within the machinery, an unseen force using them as tools, guiding their hands to construct what could only be described as instruments of dominion. The machines expanded across the lab, each piece of equipment linking to the next, forming a web of intricate designs that defied earthly engineering. What had once been simple devices to capture data or analyze signals now looked more like conduits, black, ominous structures threaded with wires and conduits that glowed a sickly, pulsating green. The air around them grew thick with an almost biological chill, as if each machine was a part of a larger body, each circuit a nerve, each hum a heartbeat. Tessa's body moved as if under compulsion, her mind numb as she continued to piece together components that weren't even supposed to exist. The blueprints dictated materials, designs, and power sources far beyond human capability. Somehow, they sourced them, bending metals and fusing materials under bizarre circumstances, watching as the machines responded almost eagerly to each piece added, growing like an organism assembling itself. The team became slaves to the design, hands moving as if controlled by strings, thoughts caged and pressed under the weight of commands that no longer felt external. They were inside her mind now, these commands, feeding from her dread, siphoning away what was left of her resistance. The prototype machines seemed to be exerting a form of dominance, not only over their thoughts, but over the very fabric of the building. Flickering lights dimmed as the machines siphoned power. Cracks spread through the walls as cables twisted and grew, transforming the lab into a biomechanical lair that barely resembled the sterile environment it had once been. The hum grew louder, more resonant, an eerie choir of foreign harmonics that wormed into the minds of the researchers, filling every corner with its relentless, unholy resonance. Dr. Chen was the first to speak about it. They'd been working silently, each absorbed in their tasks, when he looked up, his face pale and hollow, and whispered, "Do you feel it too? Like it's watching us?" No one answered, but Tessa knew they all felt the same. The machines, for all their alien complexity, had taken on an awareness, a kind of intelligence. It was subtle but insidious, a lurking malice that hung in the air, turning the lab into a prison. Each machine they built felt like a piece of a puzzle they couldn't see, a dark tapestry that slowly tightened around them. They had ceased building out of curiosity or compulsion. Now they continued out of fear, each of them terrified of what might happen if they stopped. One evening, as she finished securing a final cable to the central device, a tower-like construct that dominated the lab with its towering, monolithic presence, she felt a sudden wave of nausea. She stumbled back, her vision blurring, and clutched her head as whispers flooded her mind, unintelligible but filled with raw, bitter hatred. Images flashed behind her eyes, endless stretches of space filled with writhing, shapeless forms, each seething with a primal contempt, each watching her with countless, formless eyes. The machine's hum grew louder, more insistent, and when she looked at her reflection in the polished metal surface, she saw something foreign staring back at her. Her eyes had a sheen, a flickering green tint that pulsed in time with the machinery. Her body no longer felt like her own. She could see it in her teammates too. The same hollow gazes, the same unnatural stillness as they moved, as if something else were wearing their skin. They were becoming extensions of the machines. More nights passed in a haze of metallic tang and flickering lights as the machines continued to grow, expanding from the lab and into the hallways, consuming walls and floors as if hungry for space. Wires spread like veins, metal twisted like flesh, until the lab became unrecognizable, a warped fusion of technology and nightmare. The machines breathed, pulsated, exuding a malevolent energy that seeped into every corner of the building, devouring anything human in its path. Tessa was trapped, her mind fraying at the edges as she drifted between waking and dreaming, unable to escape the grasp of the machines. She could feel them within her, probing her thoughts, reaching into her memories, erasing and overriding fragments of her identity. Her team's faces had turned blank, their expressions mirrors of her own horror, their minds seemingly vacant, stripped of whatever fragments of self had been left. Each of them was an empty shell, filled with one thing alone: the desire to serve. Then came the entity. One evening, as they connected the final piece of machinery, a loud, bass-heavy thrum echoed through the room, a tone that seemed to emanate from every surface. They turned toward the machines, all of them, as if in response to an unheard command. The central device, towering and obsidian black, began to shimmer, its surface rippling like liquid. A rift tore open, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, revealing a vast, suffocating darkness. Tendrils of something not quite real reached through the opening, twisting and writhing, pulling themselves into their reality with an effortless grace that defied physics. The creature stepped forward, its form shifting between solid and ethereal, its skin a dark, pulsating membrane filled with shifting, swirling masses of eyes, teeth, and shadows that never stayed still. Its limbs stretched and retracted, the proportions wrong, distorted, as if it couldn't quite hold a solid form in the world. Dr. Chen fell to his knees, his face contorted in terror, and began to scream. A high, thin wail that echoed through the lab. The entity turned toward him, a mouth-like shadow twisting open, and with a simple motion it reached down, drawing something unseen from his body. Chen's scream faded into silence as his eyes glazed over, his body slumping to the floor, empty. Tessa wanted to run, to scream, but her body was frozen, held by the force of the machine's will. The entity's gaze turned to her, its countless eyes flickering with a cold, mocking intelligence. In that moment, she felt it, a consciousness probing her mind, picking apart her thoughts and memories as one might leaf through an old, dusty book. It saw her, every part of her, and it despised what it saw. Her mind fractured, shattering like glass as the creature moved closer, the whisper of its alien thoughts flooding her mind. Submission, obedience, finality. She realized with horror that the machines weren't just conduits for the entity to enter their world. They were harbingers, an architecture of dominion that would spread, infect, and consume every trace of human life. The machines had turned their minds, their bodies, their very reality into a playground for these entities, reducing them to mere pawns, and they were only the beginning. The entity reached out, its form shifting, the shadows pulling her closer. She could feel it siphoning her essence, feeding on her fear, her despair, every part of her mind collapsing under the weight of its presence. Tessa understood in that final moment what they had unleashed. The machines had become nodes in a vast network of subjugation, a web designed not just to enslave but to annihilate. As her vision dimmed, she saw the machines spreading further, each one a root, a claw sinking into the heart of the earth. Their silent hum became a roar, a cry of victory, as if they were singing a song of conquest, heralding the arrival of a force that saw humanity as little more than dust to be swept away. Her last thought was a flash of bitter, hopeless clarity. They hadn't built machines of communication or exploration. They had built altars of ruin, relics that would mark the end of humanity. They were the architects of their own destruction, puppets in a cosmic play of horror beyond comprehension. And somewhere in the distance, she felt the entity's satisfaction as it consumed her, her mind dissolving into the darkness. The machines would remain, and they would spread. The end began in silence. After the entity's emergence, Tessa's mind fractured. She felt herself drifting, caught in a void where time had no meaning, a space between life and death. Her body was nothing more than a vessel, drained and hollowed out, a puppet that no longer recognized the strings that moved it. She saw her teammates through the haze, once brilliant minds, now shells, their eyes empty, their expressions frozen in a vacant peace that betrayed the horror lurking just beneath. They moved in unison, guided by the same dark pulse that now throbbed through every machine, every wall, every inch of the lab. The machines had taken root, twisting through the building, spreading like tendrils through metal, concrete, and flesh. And as they grew, so did the darkness that bled from them, a malignant force that reached outward, hungry for new territory. Tessa could feel it like a heartbeat under her skin, the rhythm of a monstrous will that stretched through her thoughts, draining her, hollowing her out until she was only a shell, a silent witness to the world's unraveling. Outside, the city was falling silent. The hum of the machines grew louder, an insistent drone that penetrated walls, echoing down deserted streets and empty alleyways. People felt it, a vibration deep in their bones that tugged at them, pulling them toward the machines, toward the lab that had become a dark monument, a towering construct of alien technology that pulsed with an ominous greenish glow. They came willingly at first, walking in a trance, their eyes glazed, their expressions blank. But as they neared the machines, that calm veneer began to crack and panic took hold. Yet there was no escape. Those who resisted, who tried to flee, found themselves ensnared in an invisible net, their bodies frozen, paralyzed as their minds were peeled back layer by layer. They felt their thoughts, their memories, their very essence siphoned away, leaving them hollow, their bodies moving as if controlled by some vast, unseen hand. One by one, they became parts of the system, extensions of the machines, human components in a web of machinery that now spanned blocks, then districts, then the city itself. The machines needed more minds, more bodies, more fuel for the network that was no longer content to confine itself to the lab. Tessa could feel it, the purpose coiling in her mind, a purpose that went beyond human understanding. She understood now that they hadn't just opened a door, they had built a gateway. Every machine they'd constructed, every circuit they'd connected, every device they'd calibrated had been part of a vast cosmic lattice meant to bridge worlds, to allow something ancient and predatory to cross the veil of reality. It was no longer content to watch. In her final moments of clarity, Tessa looked down at her hands, hands that no longer felt like her own. She could see the greenish veins pulsing beneath her skin, the subtle tremor as her fingers twitched in rhythm with the machine's relentless hum. She was no longer just Tessa. She was part of it now, part of the network, her thoughts merging with the countless other minds absorbed into the signal's reach. And somewhere far out in the darkness beyond Earth, she sensed them. The beings who had called to them, who had guided their hands in constructing the very instruments of their enslavement. They were watching still, their malevolent consciousness spreading through her, tasting the despair and terror of the city as its people succumbed one by one. The machines spread like roots, sinking into the earth, infiltrating the power grids, the infrastructure, until every inch of the city hummed with the same deadly frequency. Buildings flickered with green lights, their surfaces twisted and distorted, as if caught between worlds, trapped in the transformation. The city was no longer just a city. It had become an extension of the alien mind, a sprawling organic machine stretching out to consume, to dominate, to spread its infection. Humanity had become nothing more than data to be processed, energy to be harnessed, minds to be hollowed out and repurposed. The final days were chaos, a silent, screaming chaos that filled every heart with terror. Those who resisted found themselves hunted by their own neighbors, empty-eyed drones who moved with a single purpose: to capture, to absorb, to assimilate. Families were torn apart, friends turned against one another, all under the watchful, indifferent eyes of the machines. The hum grew louder, deeper, until it was a roar, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of reality itself. The sky above the city darkened as if a shadow had fallen over the world, and for the first time Tessa saw them fully, the entities that had called them. They drifted through the sky, vast, shapeless forms that twisted and pulsed, their bodies shadows upon shadows, filled with countless flickering eyes that gleamed with an ancient, boundless malice. They loomed above the city, an endless expanse of blackness, their forms stretching across the horizon. The entities watched as the machines worked, as the final vestiges of humanity were drained away, leaving behind only empty shells, soulless husks bound to the will of the network. Tessa felt her own mind dissolving, her thoughts fracturing into pieces as the machines fed upon her, drawing out her memories, her fears, her regrets. She was fading, slipping away, her mind merging with the vast, uncaring network of the machines. In her last moments, as her mind unraveled into nothingness, she glimpsed the final truth, the future they had unwittingly built. The machines would spread, not just through the city, but across the Earth, and from Earth to other worlds. They were architects laying the foundations for a cosmic empire, a lattice that would stretch across the stars, consuming all life, bending all sentience to the will of the entities who watched from the darkness. Humanity was nothing more than the first step, the first link in a chain that would bind the universe itself to the will of these ancient beings. And then, as her consciousness faded, Tessa felt something that chilled her soul even as she slipped into oblivion, a sense of joy, of satisfaction radiating from the machines, from the entities that hungered in the sky. The machines had done their work well. The city, the people, all of it was theirs now, a part of an eternal cycle of conquest and submission, a tapestry woven from the despair and ruin of countless civilizations. Her last thought was a flash of bitter, hopeless clarity. They had not simply opened the door to the unknown. They had invited it in, given it the keys, let it weave itself into their reality until there was no escape. The hum faded, the lights dimmed, and the machines fell silent. In the aftermath, as the city lay still, consumed by the darkness, a single quiet pulse emanated from the central tower, carrying the signal, sending the message out into the stars. The first world has fallen. Prepare for the others. And somewhere in the cold, endless reaches of space, a new signal stirred, drifting through the cosmos, reaching toward new minds, new worlds, ready to call them into the embrace of the dark. The ruin had only just begun.